In the name of God who loves us and calls us to respond. Amen. It is said that early in his ministry, the evangelist Billy Graham arrived into a new town to preach a sermon. Wanting to mail a letter, he asked a young boy where the post office was. When the young boy had finished showing him how to get to the post office, Reverend Graham thanked him and said in his big voice, "If you'll come to the Baptist church this evening, you can hear me telling everyone how to get to heaven." The boy replied, "Gee, thanks, mister, but I don't think I'll be there. You don't even know your own way to the post office." Beloved, it has been a joy to be with you these past several weeks, to walk with you during Holy Week, to be with you in this Easter season. Some of you will know that I spent the last year in another interim ministry down in Mountain View at St. Timothy's, where you just sent Reverend Nikki, who is fabulous and whom you helped prepare for that calling. It was a good year, full of opportunity to redevelop and reimagine ministries that had been dormant in the pandemic, partnering with lay leaders and encouraging their gifts for ministry. But it was also one of the strangest years in my almost 10 years of priesthood, because it was the first and only year in which I personally, as well as the congregation I served, didn't lose a single parishioner to death. And honestly, as wonderful as that sounds, it was strange. While I don't wish death on anyone, there is something unique in the Christian witness to hear, especially in the midst of grief, the good news of the gospel recounted in the life of someone who knew Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. Someone who, as New York Times columnist David Brooks put it, lived not for their resume or their CV, but for their obituary, for their legacy. Well, that no death, no funeral streak came to a sudden and screeching halt mid-April, as in the course of just 3 days, I attended the funeral of my partner Carrie's grandfather, where we heard these words from John chapter 14, where I presided at a committal down at Trinity Cathedral in San Jose, and attended with many of you the funeral for Darby here at St.Mark's, where I read these words from John 14, often heard at funerals, and where Matt reflected on Darby's witness to the gospel here at St. Mark's and in her own life. So powerful, even a couple of years after her death earlier in the pandemic. So what do we do on a morning like this when we hear these words, these familiar words from John 14, outside of their usual context? It's like the young boy who ran into his teacher at the grocery store and was surprised to learn that she didn't live at the school full time and take all of her meals from the cafeteria. To be honest, he wouldn't have even run into her if he had gone to the Billy Graham revival, but I digress. How do we hear these words when our focus isn't mourning a friend or loved one? When we aren't attending a funeral? Are we comforted? Or perhaps when we hear these words outside of their usual context, "Do not let your hearts be troubled," some of us would say, wait, should my heart be troubled? Is there something that happened my heart should be troubled? Others of us might just hear these words and recall others whom we love but see no longer. Or we might wonder, like Thomas, if there is room for us wherever Jesus is going. has gone. Whatever it is, our focus is different. And perhaps how we hear these words is different as well. Beloved, I wonder if today we might hear them more like the disciples heard them those many years ago, which was kind of like a funeral of sorts. For them, it was an extended time of mourning in which Jesus was, in a sense, preaching his own funeral. And they had to come to terms with losing him. And so what if we might be in the midst of a funeral ourselves, not for any one person per se, but as we emerged through the pandemic, realizing things aren't the way they were 3, 5, even 10 years ago, and won't be again, that we are gathering to lay to rest and say a great amen to the long, well-lived life of a pre-pandemic way of being church. We are letting go of what was, of what might have been, as full of the gospel as it was. And Jesus is saying to us, let not your heart be troubled, for your future in God is spacious. For in my Father's house there are many rooms, many ways to be church, to feel church, to live after this death, to be a community that discovers life after that loss. Even as you experience endings and beginnings, God sustains and calls you forward in this season of resurrection. And of course, the spiritual invitation for us is found in Jesus' reply to Thomas and perhaps to our anxious question, how can we know the way? And the answer isn't something plugged into a GPS or found in a parochial report. Jesus doesn't really give them an answer at all. He offers them relationship. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. I want to go a little deeper here with the text this morning. So right there in the beginning of this familiar passage, if you want to, you can pull it out to remind yourself. There's a unique grammatical feature in the original Greek. Dr. Angela Parker, New Testament scholar, writes in her commentary that we usually hear in verse 1 what is often translated, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me." But there's something even more profound happening here. Because in the original Greek, the word for heart, he cardia, is singular, while the your that precedes it is plural. Let not your, plural, heart, singular, be troubled. And then as we say in the South, all y'all believe in God and believe also in me. Dr. Parker notes that while we do see this in Paul's writings at times, where he talks about the one body we share, John's use of the singular heart in Jesus' words here touch on the powerful experience the community will share collectively with Jesus' departure. Beloved, yesterday I witnessed a group of faithful leaders in this parish gathered for a planning retreat, sitting, you might say, with Thomas's question, how can we know the way? And story after story, conversation after conversation from the sharing of these leaders was some variation of knowing Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. And the power of sharing in that relationship here at St. Mark's. Yes, it's important as we plan that we know the way to the post office, but we also have to know why we're going. These leaders were like the disciples who walked the Emmaus road and were invited to pay attention to your, plural, heart, singular. For as you collectively find yourself in the midst of any grief for what was, surely you will find your heart burning within you as you open yourselves to what Jesus is preparing for you, as you welcome today new members of this parish who join you in what Jesus calls even greater works than these. As we say in the funeral liturgy, life is changed, not ended. And so it is for the church. It's changed, not ended. For some of us, that will be really hard. We'll insist on having a wake, and we'll need to tell stories of that church, those leaders, that era. And all of that is beautiful and full of grace. Others of us are already waiting at the graveside with flowers. And not to jump on the toes of next week's preacher, but God has promised to be with us always, to send an advocate, a comforter, a companion, a spirit of reconciliation, of relationship, of resurrection. So, as the old country preachers used to say, I've just stopped by this morning, St. Mark's, to tell you that your heart is strong. And I can't wait to see what Jesus is preparing for you. Amen.